What's going on, everybody? TJ Hernandez here, the director of DFS at 4for4.com. Here to give you 5 tips to give yourself the best chance to win Best Ball Mania 3 and $2 million. Before I get into it today, if you're watching this, please like and subscribe to the 4for4 YouTube channel. Helps us out a ton to get these coming to you all off season. So let's jump right into it. Tip 1. Draft early and often. I know a lot of people play traditional redraft, jumping into Underdog Best Ball Mania for the first time in a big tournament. They usually don't start drafting until August. Draft as much as you can starting now. And even if you haven't started yet, it's not too early. There's still plenty of time. We still have all of July, all of August, and a little bit of September to draft. And one of the benefits of drafting all off season is you're going to get natural diversification through your different drafts, through different draft slots, through different draft flows. Just playing a lot of different leagues, you're going to get exposure to a lot of different players. You're also going to be able to take advantage, if you start drafting now, of the always changing values of players. Players' ADP now isn't the same as it's going to be the week before the season starts. So by drafting early and often, we can get access to players that are cheaper now than they might be later in the off season. And it also helps you build a really strong understanding of draft flow, how to build your team, how to come about different roster construction techniques before August and September, when we have the sharpest ADPs and when the field softens up and the casual players are drafting the most. If you start drafting now, you're going to be way ahead of them and you're going to be able to adjust on the fly much better than people that are just starting right before the season starts. Tip number 2. Master positional allocation and roster construction. This is basically just how many players you're drafting each position, and when you are drafting those players, we talked about it, the positional allocation, in our last video. Here, we're just reminding you to make sure you are mastering those concepts and take them on over into roster construction. Roster construction and positional allocation, it's the backbone of being a successful best ball player. Whether it's a standard 12-man league or Best Ball Mania 3, this is going to help you be the best ball player, going to give you the strongest foundation. And what we're really talking about when it comes to positional allocation and roster construction is the draft capital that you're spending at each position. Naturally, if you take a tight end in the first or second round, you're going to more often than not come away with 2 tight ends instead of 3. Goes the same for all the other positions, but if we understand positional allocation and roster construction and how many players we could be taking to each position, those roster construction techniques are going to give us as big of an advantage, if not bigger, than somebody that is just trying to draft the best players every single round. Number 3 tip. Understand what makes a roster unique in Best Ball Mania 3. Now, what this is not taking a bunch of players way before their ADP just for the sake of building a unique team. Sure, you can have the first pick and take Devontae Adams first overall and say nobody else is doing that, but that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about building a unique team. We're still thinking about player values. We're still trying to adhere to positional allocation and roster construction techniques, but once we master those techniques, we can take them to the extreme and understand when we could stray away from them. One of the easiest ways to be unique is through unique roster construction strategies. And the best thing about things like a unique roster construction strategy or a fringe strategy is that you can use them sparingly and still be very effective. An example that I've used all offseason is something like zero running back. Zero running back gets a lot of digital ink because it is so polarizing, but the truth is not that many people are using a true zero running back approach. Last season, barely 4% of the field in Best Ball Mania 2 used zero RB, but 10% of the final teams had a zero RB team. If we look at what we called an optimal zero RB team, where they drafted 7 running backs, less than 1% of the field was doing that. So you don't need to be using these a ton. If you're only drafting 5, 6, 7% of your teams with zero RB, you're still ahead of the field. But these are things that can be used few and far between, but still be very effective. Another way of being unique, stacking and correlation. You've probably heard a ton about stacking and correlation, specifically in Best Ball Mania 3 and in large field tournaments, things like big DFS tournaments, now big best ball tournaments. We should be paying attention to stacking and correlation. Now, Again, what we don't want to be doing, we don't want to be forcing early round stacks. We can look at optimal stacks that have been the most successful in past Best Ball Mania tournaments, and emulate those. One classic example of that, a quarterback with his running back 2 and a wide receiver 4. That was used on just over 1% of teams over the last 2 Best Ball Mania tournaments, but it's had the highest advance rate of any stack used. Also, when you're stacking, one thing we found very effective in Best Ball Mania tournaments, using a lot of small stacks as compared to massive team stacks. Now, this doesn't mean you should never be stacking 3 or 4 players for one team, but in general, giving us more game stacks, more small player stacks, these are going to be the most effective ways to stack. And then stacking for our most high leverage spots, namely weeks 15 through 17. Once we advance past the first round, all of the money is in those late rounds, and obviously the biggest money, the last week of the season, week 17, those are the weeks we want to be optimizing for. And one final way to get unique is through late round drafting. Now, the vast majority of relevant fantasy players are going to be in 100% of leagues. But when we get into the late rounds, roughly around 16 and on, some of those players aren't going to be drafted in every league. And if we go really far down the depth chart, we could find players that might only be drafted in 20% or even less of leagues. If those players hit, that's a great way to be unique. One way to think about how to target those players, teams that complete stacks, players that complete stacks for, say, a mini quarterback stack. A wide receiver 4 might be available in the last round that isn't being drafted in every single league. Or players that are in depth chart battles or ambiguous positional battles. Sometimes we are bad at projecting those, and if you sometimes take a RB3 or a wide receiver 4 that isn't being drafted, by the time it comes around to those playoff weeks, we're looking at players that are starters on their teams now. Tip number 4, plant your flag. And when I say plant your flag, I mean if you like a player, attack that player aggressively. If you don't like a player, feel free to fade him aggressively. Now, I'm not saying you should have 0% of, say, a first-round player, but just like in DFS, if you're trying to cover all your bases to limit your downside, all you're really doing is limiting your upside. By taking stands on players that you're high on, you're maximizing the number of combinations you have to hit perfectly when you are right. So say you are very high on a Miles Sanders. If you have more combinations of Miles Sanders and combinations of players around him, when he hits, you're maximizing your opportunities to have that perfect team that you need to win Best Ball Mania 3. So again, trying to cover all your bases, you're just going to limit your upside. Coming third in your league is the same as coming in 451,000th in this tournament. If you don't cash, you don't cash. So we're playing for first place. We're not playing just to cash or just to come in the top 50% of our league. Last, final, maybe most important tip, be flexible. You shouldn't go into any one draft with a preconceived notion of how that draft is going to go. All of these tips that I've laid out here, they can be used throughout all of your drafts, but you need to pick and choose your spots. You have to go in knowing that you need to learn to understand draft flow, that you need to be able to change your strategy on the fly based on things like your draft position, positional runs, and maybe some players ahead of you that you might anticipate going earlier or later than other players expect. So don't go into any draft with a single set strategy. Having some preset allocations in mind can help you guide your decisions. Things like how often you want to be drafting a 0 running back team, how heavy you want to be on a single player, how often you want to be fading a single player. If you know these things going into your drafts, then you can adjust on the fly quickly, more quick than your opponents. And this goes back to drafting early in the season. If you are able to build that muscle memory, you're going to do a better job of drafting and adjusting on the fly. So just make sure you're being flexible all the time going into your drafts. If you want to dive more into these tips or best ball strategy, check out the 4for4 Underdog Strategy Hub and the Best Ball Mania Bible. Dives into all these concepts. We also have tools and rankings available there. And if you haven't signed up for Underdog yet, you can get a free Pro or DFS 4for4 subscription with just a $10 deposit. Make sure you check out that offer in the link in the description below. Thank you for watching.